Hi, this is Betty. I'm just saying. Some time ago, years ago, in fact, I had a button that said, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. I thought it was a profound statement at the time, and it's even more profound as I've seen ignorance and what ignorance has done to the country, what ignorance has done to individual people, what ignorance has cost us in terms of millions of dollars, ignorance that have cost people their lives. And then I thought about education. I thought about the difference that education made in my life. I thought about, my father going to the seventh grade and never getting further than that, but being self educated. My father listened to constant all news radio, and he read many papers back in New York City when there were a lot of daily papers. And I thought about the fact that I grew up in New York City and that New York City was very, very wise years ago in creating a public education system, higher education system. I graduated, for example, from one of the city universities in New York. It was Hunter College, City University of New York. The oldest one in the network of New York City colleges is City College, which is in West Harlem. And there were city colleges, similar ones, Queens College, Brooklyn College, and a lot of us who were from poor families and working class families, we went to these institutions. And when I went to school, it was tuition free. Most of us did not graduate with debt because the city university was free. All you had to do was perform enough to get in, and you could go to school. It was a very wise investment for New York City to make. And the wisdom of it is seen in the people who come through the public university system in New York City. The people who became Nobel laureates and, in the sciences, in literature, and the arts. Ruby Dee, the actress, many people of a certain generation all came through the public university system. One of the, either one of the schools, Hunter College, Queens College, City College, and Baruch College was one of them in the university system. And a few years ago, a man named Stuart Subotnick came to the Kentucky Derby and had his horse in the Derby. I was talking to a friend of mine, and he does hosting at the Kentucky Derby of the horse owners that come in to run their horses. And he said, I'm hosting this man, and his name is Stuart Slobnick or something. He couldn't pronounce it. I said, you mean Stuart Subotnick? He said, yes, that's who I'm hosting. I said, I used to be Stuart Subotnick's secretary back in the days, in the 60s when I worked for Metro Media. And Stuart was an up and coming accountant at Metro Media. And in fact, he shared me with another guy. I, worked for the two of them, and I was their secretary. And so we got in touch with Stuart, and Stuart remembered me and said, hey, invite Betty to the Derby. And it ended up that Derby, Stuart had a horse in the Derby, and I sat up in the box with the owners and stuff with Stuart and his wife. They flew down here in a private plane. They, I didn't know that Stuart had gone on to become that rich. But I later discovered that Stuart Subotnick grew up to be one of the richest men in America. From an accountant that I was his secretary for in the 80s to one of the richest men in America because he made a connection with John Kluge, the media magnate who owned Metro Media. And when Stuart was just 39, John Kluge gave him a big break. And the one thing that John Kluge said about Stuart that he really liked was people were saying, why are you putting this young guy with this big title in charge of this money? It turns out that Kluge was impressed that Stuart, like me, and like a lot of us in New York City, he grew up in public housing in Brooklyn. And Stuart went to Baruch College, one of the city university's system schools, where we didn't have to pay tuition. And Stuart went on to marry Anita, who sadly passed away in 2015, to marry Anita. And they had a couple of kids. And when he was back here, I hung out with Stuart and Anita all day until they got back on their plane. But Stuart, like me, like not a lot of New Yorkers, people tell you about what the government cannot do for people. We lived in public housing that was financed by the taxpayers of New York City. We went to universities that were financed by the taxpayers of New York City. This college, these colleges that were part of the city university system, they called it the Harvard for the proletariat. It was higher education for the working class people. And many of us who went to these schools, again, we did not come out millions of dollars in debt because, at least for our bachelor's degrees, we didn't have to pay anything. And what New York City wisely did through the city university system was that they created a whole class of people, white, black, Latino, and especially Jewish people too, because they weren't wanted in some of the private colleges and institutions. But the city university educated doctors and lawyers and teachers and firemen and police officers, people who, when they finished their degrees in criminology, mine was in communications, Stuart was in accounting. When they completed those degrees, they became the backbone of the so-called middle class in New York City. And many of us rose up out of the projects and were able to contribute back to our communities. Most of us were the first people in our families to graduate from college. Many of our parents had come from other places, maybe from overseas. My parents came from down south as part of the Great Migration. And the city made a wise investment. And so almost any New Yorker of a certain age, maybe 65 and up, many of us are graduates of the free public college system that even to this day is still very cheap. But we didn't have to pay tuition because somebody thought that it made sense to educate poor people and working class people to contribute to the city. And now, I've been living in Kentucky for so many years, and the educational attainment level here is very low. And I think about Mitch McConnell, who is the majority whip in Congress, and how long in the Senate, and how long he's been there. And that education in Kentucky is still, like some people think, something that the government shouldn't have much to do with, and certainly not higher education. And so a lot of the kids in Kentucky and some of these places are coming out of school with tremendous debt for the same kinds of education, and maybe not even as good as many of us enjoyed, for little or nothing. New York made a decision that ignorance was expensive and that educating the people would create benefit for the city, that an educated populace would become taxpayers, that an educated populace would become the doctors and the lawyers and the teachers and the actresses and the musicians and the poets and the people that came out of the public education system through the city university system. This dates back to the 1800s. They were wise enough to make that decision. I do not understand why in 2017 these states and the government is not smart enough or thoughtful enough to say, let us invest in education. Let us provide higher education for kids who come from families that don't have the money to afford a lot of tuition. And let us make it cheap for them or free. It's an investment. It's an investment. New York City is the city that it is today with the money that it has because it created a generation of people who were educated from the 1800s right on through, who were educated enough to become the backbones of the city. And many of them who were the first in their family to go to college started that tradition with their own children who went through the city public education system for higher education. And every time I hear about a tuition increase at even some of the state schools and the city schools, I think we are making a bad decision. We are deciding that education is too expensive, but really it is ignorance that is very expensive. We can see that now. We have a president who barely reads, apparently. We don't have people who can think for themselves, people who are not critical thinkers, people who are looking to be led. And the one thing that I always say, that education doesn't make you smart. There are a lot of very smart people who've never gone to college. But what college does is it teaches you how to find out what you want to know. College gives you those connections that you need to get to the next step of where you want to go in life. Some of the friends that we make in college, we will have forever. But those are the connections when you come out of school and you need a job and you need to know somebody. And to think that the man that I was a secretary for years ago grew up to be one of the richest men in America, and that he came out of public housing projects in New York, poor just like me, except he was Jewish, and that he came up in a company where he was a low-level accountant in this giant conglomerate and caught the attention of the man who headed the company, who was impressed with his background because it was so similar to his own. So I just asked myself, why do we think that we should not invest all that we can in education? I hear people say, well, I don't want to pay taxes. I don't have children. Well, the thing that I always say to people, if you have people who don't have money and don't have jobs and don't have opportunity and don't have hope, you cannot build walls high enough to keep them from coming across the wall to get what you got. Education is an investment. So I say to Kentucky and to these other states, particularly in the South, that still are poor, still at the lowest level of education in terms of overall attainment, that you need to be investing in education, just like healthcare, because the dividends pay off again and again and again. I'm just saying, you don't have to agree with me, but I do agree with the person who first said, if you think education is important, try ignorance. And God knows there's enough ignorance in the world. As I said, I'm just saying, I'd like to know what you think.